The camera pans across a sun-scorched farmland, a woman's hands trembling as she discovers the truth. Her neighbor's face flashes, smug, calculating. Then, a low, ominous moo echoes across the valley. The camera cuts to a herd of massive black cattle charging forward like a tsunami of horns and muscle. The neighbor's scream pierces the air. Wide-eyed cows bearing down. Cut to black. For 6 weeks, the sky above Millbrook Farm had been a slab of white heat, relentless and unforgiving. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of her property, boots sinking into dust that used to be soil, and stared at the well gauge reading empty. Not almost empty. Empty. The needle had dropped past the red zone into nothing. Her 47 Angus cattle crowded the fencing nearest the barn, their dark hides matted with sweat, their eyes desperate. They'd stopped lowing yesterday. That was the thing about true thirst, Sarah had learned. It silenced them. The younger calves pressed against their mothers, flanks heaving in the oppressive heat. "Come on, baby," Sarah whispered to the well pump, priming it again, though she'd already tried this a dozen times. Nothing. The ancient hand pump, installed in 1987 when her grandparents still owned the place, had finally given up. Her fingers were raw from working the handle. Water was supposed to be at 90 feet down. The drought had dropped the water table to 120, maybe deeper. The well was officially dead until the rains came, if the rains came. Sarah's phone buzzed. Tom, her husband, texting from the city where he worked as an engineer. Any luck? He'd only managed to get out for weekends for the last month. She didn't respond. What was there to say? That she'd already called 3 contractors and they were all booked weeks out? That a new well would cost $15,000 she didn't have? That the cattle needed water today, not in August? The dust devil that kicked up across the eastern pasture caught her attention. It swirled past the property line, past the painted rock that marked the boundary between Millbrook Farm and Whitmore Ranch, the sprawling 20-acre estate that belonged to Patricia Whitmore. Sarah watched Patricia's house, set back from the road on a gentle slope. The manicured lawn was still green. Still green. In the middle of a drought, the sprinklers must have run this morning. Sarah could see the wet patches from where she stood. And Patricia's in-ground pool, visible from certain angles, glinted with water so inviting it made Sarah's throat close up. Patricia had money. Old money, inherited money. She'd bought the property 5 years ago, built her dream home, installed all the amenities, and spent most of her time in the city anyway. Meanwhile, Sarah was here, actually working the land, actually depending on it. The unfairness of it twisted something in Sarah's chest. She turned back to the well and tried the pump again. Still nothing. By evening, Sarah had made the decision. She couldn't afford a new well. The neighbors 3 miles down were hit harder. They'd already evacuated their livestock. The grocery store was out of bottled water. She'd driven 40 minutes to the next town over and barely found a pallet. The county had issued water conservation orders. No lawn watering, no car washing, minimal indoor use. The fire department was on high alert, but cattle needed 50 gallons per head per day. It was non-negotiable. Sarah had a plan that wasn't quite a plan yet, more of a desperate idea taking shape. Patricia Whitmore's well was new. Top-of-the-line solar-powered system installed 2 years ago. Patricia almost never used her property. She was in Manhattan most of the time, according to the neighborhood gossip. Her well probably had more water than the township reservoir. Just a little, Sarah thought. Just enough to keep the herd alive until she could figure something out. Until Tom's next paycheck. Until something broke in her favor. She called Tom at 10 that night. "We need $15,000, she said, without preamble. There was a pause. "For what?" "New well. This one's done." Another pause, longer this time. She heard him breathing, heard the clink of ice in a glass. "Sarah, we can't. The mortgage—" "Then what do I do? Let them die?" "I don't know." "Call the extension office. Look into loans." "But we can't just—" He stopped. When would it even get done? That's the problem. Not for weeks. She hung up before he could offer false comfort or another reason why their situation was impossible. At midnight, Sarah filled her truck bed with every container she owned, 200-gallon tanks, 5-gallon jugs, buckets. She drove them across the eastern pasture, following the dirt track that skirted the property line. Patricia's house was dark, the driveway empty. Her car was registered in the city. The spigot outside Patricia's pump house was easy to access, hidden behind a flowering jasmine that still somehow bloomed despite the heat. Sarah attached a hose and let water rush into her first tank. The sound of it seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, like she was screaming her desperation into the darkness. She worked quickly, methodically, her jaw set. This was survival. This was keeping her livestock alive. This was wrong, but it was necessary. An hour later, her truck was loaded. She drove back to Millbrook Farm, parked the tanks near the cattle trough, and began siphoning. The cattle came running at the sound of water. They drank with an urgency that broke her heart and justified it in equal measure. Their hides seemed to plump slightly, their eyes less hollow. The calves pushed in beside their mothers, and Sarah watched them drink their fill for the first time in 3 days. It was the easiest crime she'd ever committed. She did it again the next night, and the night after that. By the 4th night, it had become routine. Load the tanks, drive across the property line, fill them at Patricia's spigot, drive back. Sarah felt the rhythm of it in her bones. She rationalized it in the dark hours of the morning. Patricia wasn't even here. Patricia would never know. Patricia had money to spare. Literally to spare. Enough to water a lawn and fill a pool while people and animals suffered. The injustice of it felt clean compared to the thirst in her cattle's eyes. But on the 9th night, Sarah's truck wouldn't start. She turned the key and heard the dead click of a dead battery. She tried again, and the truck mocked her with silence. Sarah stood in her driveway at 11 p.m., sweat cooling on her skin, her containers loaded and ready, and felt panic rise in her throat like floodwater. She was trapped. If she couldn't get the water, the cattle would start dying tomorrow. The younger calves first. The pregnant heifers would miscarry. By next week, she'd have nothing left but corpses and debt. Sarah took a breath, centered herself. Tom's car was parked by the barn. He'd come out for the weekend yesterday. She could take his. He wouldn't even notice if she put the gas back in. But when she got to his car, she found something taped to the steering wheel. A photograph printed on cheap paper, corners already curling in the heat. It showed her truck, loaded with water tanks, silhouetted against Patricia Whitmore's pump house light. There was a note, written in precise handwriting. "I know what you've been doing. I know. And I'm giving you one chance to stop. One. If I catch you again, I'm calling the sheriff and pressing charges for theft and trespassing. Don't test me, Sarah. I have cameras. I have everything." P.W. Sarah's hands shook as she read it again. Once, twice, 3 times. Patricia knew, and for the first time in 9 days, Sarah felt something break inside her. Not with mercy, with something much colder. If Patricia was willing to let her starve rather than share, then Patricia didn't deserve mercy either. Sarah got in Tom's car and drove to fill her tanks anyway. The next morning, Sarah found the cease and desist letter in her mailbox, printed on ivory cardstock with a lawyer's letterhead from the firm that Patricia kept on retainer. The language was vicious: theft of water resources, criminal trespass, threat of immediate prosecution if the unauthorized extraction continued. The letter was dated the day Patricia had left the note. Patricia wasn't bluffing. Patricia never bluffed. Sarah had seen her around town maybe twice in the 5 years since she'd moved to the area. Both times, Patricia had been dressed expensively, moving with the assured confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Once at the grocery store, she'd made a comment to the cashier loud enough for Sarah to hear. Something about how it was such a shame that some people couldn't manage their properties properly. That letting land go fallow was so indicative of character. That had been before the drought, before Sarah was desperate. Tom read the letter 3 times, his jaw tightening. "She's serious." "She's cruel," Sarah said. They were standing in the kitchen. The cattle were in the barn, where Sarah had moved them to minimize their water loss through sweating. 47 Angus in a structure designed for 20. It was like a furnace in there, but it was the only way she could reduce their water needs until what? Until a miracle? "We need to handle this properly," Tom said. We can fight this. Call our own lawyer, explain the circumstances. No court is going to side with her when people are suffering. You think? Sarah's voice was sharp. Because I looked at the county water emergency handbook. Theft is theft. We don't have legal rights to her water, no matter how much we need it. Then we apply for emergency aid. We contact the Agricultural Extension, the Drought Relief Board. That takes time, Tom. That takes weeks. My cattle have days. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the helplessness in his eyes. He was a numbers guy, a problem solver. He could not problem solve his way out of this. So what do you want to do? He asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer. She already knew what she wanted to do, what she was going to do. That night, she drove past Patricia's house in her truck, the empty water tanks rattling in the bed. The house was lit up. Patricia was here. Back from the city. Sarah could see her through the front window, moving in the living room with a drink in her hand, completely unaware that she was being watched, completely unaware that she'd just made an enemy of someone with nothing left to lose. Sarah didn't go to the pump house. Instead, she drove back to Millbrook Farm and sat in the barn with her cattle, listening to them breathe, their water trough sitting empty beside them. She ran her hands along the cattle's ribs, feeling them more prominent each day. The calves were listless now, spending most of their time lying down, conserving energy. There was one young heifer, Belle, that Sarah had raised by bottle as a calf when her mother had died in a difficult birth. Belle recognized Sarah's voice, raised her head now with effort. "I'm sorry, baby," Sarah whispered, and meant it with an intensity that frightened her. The next morning, Tom left for the city, kissing Sarah goodbye, telling her to call the extension office to find a way, to stay strong. She watched him drive away and felt the last thread of normal life disappear with him. The heat spiked to 127 degrees. The grass on the pasture wasn't just brown, it was ash gray, crumbling to dust when stepped on. The sky pressed down like a lid on an oven. By afternoon, the first calf collapsed. It was one of the younger ones, a bull calf born just this spring. He went down in the barn, his breathing shallow, his eyes rolling. Sarah pulled him out into the shade, tried to cool his skin with water from the emergency supply she'd been rationing for herself. But she had maybe 10 gallons left. It wasn't enough. She called the veterinarian. He came out in a truck with air conditioning, examined the calf with grim efficiency, and delivered his diagnosis. Acute heat stress, borderline heat stroke. The calf needed significant water and electrolytes. The whole herd was at critical risk. "I can give him IV fluids," the vet said. "But Sarah, you need to understand, this is going to get worse. A lot worse." "I know. Have you contacted the county?" "There are emergency protocols. I've been told I can't access additional water sources," she said flatly. The vet was quiet for a moment, and Sarah saw him do the math in his head. A neighbor with a well. The drought. The cease and desist that would inevitably come. "That's a bad situation," he said finally. "I'm sorry." He left his bill, $600, and his condolences. The calf died at midnight. Sarah sat with him in the barn as his breathing became irregular, then stopped. She held his head, hot and light against her chest, and cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to since this started. When it was over, she wrapped him in a tarp and left him in the storage shed, because she didn't have the emotional bandwidth to deal with burial or rendering services today. By the next morning, 2 more animals were showing signs of serious heat stress. Sarah made a decision. She waited until dark. She filled her truck with containers again. She drove across the property line and pulled up to Patricia's pump house, not bothering to hide the truck. She wasn't going to steal water anymore. She was going to destroy the pump. She'd found the tools in her barn, a sledgehammer and a crowbar from her grandfather's time. She worked methodically, smashing the solar panels, tearing apart the pump mechanism, destroying thousands of dollars of equipment with the sort of fury that felt clean and honest and terrifying in its intensity. It took 20 minutes. When she was done, she loaded her containers with water from Patricia's backup tank. There was one, of course there was. Emergency backup for her emergency backup, and she drove back to Millbrook Farm. She didn't go home. She went straight to the barn and filled the trough. Her cattle came running, and they drank like they'd been given a second life. At 6 a.m., her phone rang. Patricia. "You destroyed my well," Patricia said. No greeting, no preamble. Rage, raw and edged, underlying every word. "I needed water for my cattle," Sarah said. "You need to understand that you've just committed felony destruction of property. I have cameras. I have video. The police are already—" Sarah hung up. 2 hours later, the sheriff's deputy pulled into her driveway. The deputy was named Marcus Webb, and he'd worked Millbrook County for 15 years. He knew Sarah's family, had bought honey from her grandfather back in the day, had even helped search for one of her breeding bulls when it had escaped 5 summers ago. He wasn't smiling now. "I need to see the well," he said. And Sarah could hear the weariness in his voice. He already knew, already understood that he was caught between 2 people and a drought and the terrible mathematics of property law. They drove over in his cruiser. Patricia's pump house was a sculpture of destruction. Solar panels in glittering fragments, the pump's housing cracked open, copper piping bent at impossible angles. It looked like violence, like rage. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. "She was letting my cattle die," Sarah said. "She has more water than she could use in a decade, and she had lawyers threatening me with prosecution for trying to keep my animals alive." "I understand," Marcus said, and she believed that he did. "But Sarah, this is a felony. Property damage over $500, it's a felony. I know, Patricia's pressing charges. She called her lawyer after she called us, and they're pushing for the maximum. She's angry." "Good." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the destroyed equipment. "You know what's going to happen, right? You'll be arrested, charged, probably convicted. You'll have a record. You might lose the farm if the restitution costs are high enough. My cattle were dying. I know." He pulled out a notepad. "I still have to do this. The arrest was surreal." Marcus read her rights with an apologetic tone. She was fingerprinted and photographed in the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office. Tom came to pick her up, his face dark with shock and anger, though whether he was angry at her or the situation or the whole world remained unclear. The lawyer they hired, Tom's cousin, cheaper than the alternatives, said she had almost no defense. Patricia was technically correct. The well and pump were her property. The destruction was documented. The cameras had captured everything. "What about a necessity defense?" Sarah asked. "I was trying to prevent harm to animals, not people," the lawyer said. "The courts have been very narrow about necessity defenses. Honestly, Sarah, you're looking at probably a felony conviction. Maybe jail time, maybe probation. Definitely fines. Definitely restitution to Patricia Whitmore for the property damage." The estimate for the well and pump replacement was $47,000. Sarah's world collapsed into a point of absolute loss. But then something unexpected happened. The story got out. A local journalist picked it up. "Drought-stricken farmer destroys wealthy neighbor's well." It wasn't a huge story, not at first, just a paragraph in the regional section of the paper. But social media caught it. Then a blogger with an environmental angle wrote about it. Then a podcast about rural economics. Then a news magazine. By the time the preliminary hearing rolled around, there were news vans parked outside the courthouse. The narrative had shifted. Sarah wasn't a criminal now. She was a desperate woman pushed to a breaking point. Patricia was no longer just a neighbor. She was a symbol of wealth indifference, of resources hoarded while people suffered. The comments online ranged from supportive to viciously condemning, but the balance had tipped. During the hearing, Sarah's lawyer argued passion crime, argued necessity, argued that destroying property was a disproportionate response, but understandable given the circumstances. The prosecutor argued that no personal hardship justified felony destruction of property. What changed everything was Belle. The heifer had survived the worst of the drought on the emergency water. Sarah had managed to salvage and steal. When Sarah brought pictures of her cattle to court, showing the progression from healthy to skeletal in just 4 weeks, Belle was in several of them. In one, Belle's head was resting against Sarah's shoulder, and there was such genuine affection in the image that even the hard-faced prosecutor seemed uncomfortable. "These are animals you've raised," Sarah's lawyer said. Animals you depend on as both livelihood and family? Yes, Sarah said. Belle was orphaned as a calf. I raised her by hand. And on the night you destroyed Ms. Whitmore's well, how many of your animals were showing signs of critical heat stress? 5. The calf died that morning. 2 more were very close. The hearing didn't result in dismissal, but it did result in the judge ordering a psychiatric evaluation and recommending the case be considered for the diversion program. In layman's terms, if Sarah stayed clean, did community service, paid down restitution over a reasonable timeline, she could get the felony expunged. Patricia wanted to fight it. She scheduled a meeting with the prosecutor, threatened to pursue the maximum penalties, hired her lawyer to argue that Sarah was a danger and needed jail time. The news people got wind of this too. Suddenly, cameras were following Patricia to her car. Journalists asking how it felt to press maximum charges against a woman whose livestock were dying. Patricia stopped talking to press after the first day. Still, she wouldn't back down on the restitution, $47,000. Sarah would pay it or face collection proceedings or watch her farm go to lien. It was a slow financial death, but it was death. Then, in early August, the rain came. It started as a drizzle on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, it was a downpour. By Thursday, the rain had soaked the ground to 8 inches deep. The creek that ran between Millbrook Farm and Whitmore Ranch, dry for 2 months, began to flow again. The water table rose. Within a week, Sarah's well had water again, but that wasn't the end of Patricia's problem. The rain had been torrential enough to overwhelm the county's drainage systems. It had been heavy enough that standing water accumulated in low-lying areas. And Patricia's property, with its meticulously groomed lawns and its installed French drainage system, all designed for the drought, suddenly became a sponge. Water pooled in her basement. Seepage started along the foundation. The landscaping that had been her pride, thousands of dollars worth of drought-resistant xeriscaping, suddenly became a mudslide hazard on the slope leading to her house. She called contractors. Every single one had a waiting list weeks long, all backed up from emergency calls across the drought-stricken county. Then she discovered the real problem. The destroyed well had been contaminated by the destruction. Water was seeping from the broken pump housing into her property's underground water system. Her backup well was now compromised. The water coming up from the ground was brown, undrinkable, potentially dangerous. Sarah heard about this through Patricia's calls to the county health department, which became public record when Patricia tried to sue the county for emergency remediation assistance. Patricia had no water. Patricia, who'd hoarded it so carefully just weeks ago, now had nothing. She called Sarah directly, her voice tight with controlled rage. "This isn't over," Patricia said. "No," Sarah agreed. "It's just beginning." Sarah had never intended to hurt Patricia's cattle. She'd never intended to buy the feed from the commercial operation down in Millbrook Valley that she knew was being treated with a specific agricultural additive. She'd never intended to have it delivered to the property line between the 2 farms and to have it somehow misdelivered to Patricia's grazing pasture, where Patricia's 6-show cattle, championship Herefords that cost thousands each, would find it and eat it, or rather, she had intended it. But she'd also never planned to do it. Sarah had spent weeks thinking about how to make Patricia pay, every moment of torture. And that's what it had been. Torture watching her animals suffer while her neighbor hoarded, had crystallized into this burning desire for reciprocal harm. An eye for an eye, a heifer for a heifer, suffering for suffering. Then Tom had caught her with the feed delivery receipt. He was going through their banking statements, trying to figure out how to manage the restitution payments when he saw the charge. He'd looked at Sarah with confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like fear. "Tell me you didn't," he said. She had. It was already ordered. It was arriving in 2 days. Tom made her get in the car with him. They drove to the farm, and he made her call the delivery company and cancel. It took 20 minutes of explanation and apologies. The company tried to charge a cancellation fee. Tom paid it without question. "We're not becoming murderers," Tom said. They were sitting in the truck in the farm driveway, the sun setting into a haze of heat even with rain. Not even the figurative kind. They're just animals, Sarah said, but the words felt hollow and ugly even as she spoke them. No, Tom said quietly. They're not. And you're not the kind of person who kills for revenge. Don't let this make you that person. Sarah had cried then, angry tears of frustration and fury, and the terrifying realization that she was still capable of being pushed into something monstrous. That Patricia had pushed her that far, so instead, Sarah let nature do the harm. Patricia's well situation got worse before it got better. The contamination spread to her property's main water line. She was forced to call for trucked-in water for her house, paying premium rates during the post-drought emergency when every water service was booked solid. The health department ordered the wells sealed and professionally decontaminated, another $10,000. Meanwhile, the heavy rains had revealed another problem with Patricia's luxury home. The foundation had shifted during the drought. Now, with the water table rising, hydrostatic pressure was pushing up through the basement. The waterproofing that had been installed by the cheapest contractor Patricia could find 5 years ago was failing. The house would need major foundation work. The irony was so perfect that Sarah wondered if there was a cosmic architect managing the revenge. Patricia sold the property in September. The buyer got it cheap, and Patricia lost money on the deal, about $200,000 less than she'd paid for it. Once you factored in the foundation repairs that were going to be necessary and the destroyed well that still needed to be replaced. Sarah heard about the sale through the neighborhood gossip chain. She felt a flutter of satisfaction that was pure, untainted by guilt. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the truly catastrophic part. Patricia couldn't accept losing. Couldn't accept that she'd been bested by a farmer, by circumstances, by the goddamn weather. So she filed a countersuit against Sarah, claiming that the destroyed well had caused the water contamination and the property damage. She wanted restitution on top of the restitution Sarah already owed her for the destroyed pump. It was a Hail Mary lawsuit. Probably frivolous but expensive to defend against. Sarah's lawyer said they could fight it, but it would take months and cost significant money. Or she could try to settle. Patricia was asking for an additional $75,000. Basically demanding that Sarah give her enough money to recoup her losses on the house sale. In total, between the well destruction charges and the countersuit, Sarah would owe $120,000. There was no way in any universe where the math worked. Tom had started drinking more, just in the evenings, just to cope, but Sarah noticed. She noticed the silences, the way he looked at the farm with exhaustion instead of hope. They'd already taken out a second mortgage to cover the legal fees. The bank was already sniffing around about the first mortgage as Sarah's income collapsed with the loss of cattle sales revenue. The farm wasn't going to survive this. Sarah was going to lose everything. And then, on an unremarkable Tuesday morning in late September, something shifted. Sarah woke to the sound of her cattle panicking. She ran to the barn in her pajamas, heart-hammering, expecting to find injury or sickness or some disaster. Instead, she found her cattle crowding at the eastern fence, staring toward Patricia's former property. What had been Whitmore Ranch was now overrun. The new owner had made some decisions, poor decisions. He'd hired a contractor to clear the overgrown areas, and in doing so, he'd inadvertently broken the fence line. 43 head of cattle, dairy cows, not the expensive show cattle, had gotten loose. They'd found the broken fence between properties and had wandered onto Sarah's land, where the grass was greener and the water was running again. It was chaos. 43 strange cattle mixing with her herd, potential injuries, possible disease transmission, territorial disputes. It was a disaster, but it was also an opportunity. Sarah called the sheriff's office and reported the trespass. She called the county livestock commission. She documented everything with photographs. And when the new property owner arrived in a panic, Sarah had already established that these were his cattle on her property without her permission, causing damage to her fences and grazing. It was called trespass by livestock. There were penalties. There were damages. Sarah pressed every single one of them. The new property owner, a developer, from the city who'd bought the place as a future investment, had to pay, to have his cattle retrieved and corralled. He had to pay for fence repairs. He had to pay for veterinary inspections of Sarah's herd to ensure no disease had spread. He had to pay for the market value of any of Sarah's cattle that might be permanently stressed or injured. It came to approximately $63,000 in damages. The developer, furious at his own incompetence and trying to recover his losses, sued the contractor who'd broken the fence. The contractor, facing the lawsuit, had to disclose that he'd been using equipment that belonged to Patricia Whitmore, equipment she'd left on the property when she sold it, and that she'd never retrieved. Patricia got sued by the developer. Her insurance got involved. The whole thing spiraled into legal warfare that would take months to resolve, none of which helped Sarah, except in one crucial way. Because now the developer was desperate to get the property back under control and stop the bleeding of legal fees. And he discovered that Patricia was still on the title as a registered owner of the equipment left behind, which meant she had some liability for the accident. Patricia, facing her own lawsuit from the developer, decided she didn't have the bandwidth for a counterclaim against Sarah. She dropped the lawsuit entirely. The restitution for the well destruction still stood, but Sarah could manage that with monthly payments over 7 years. It was survivable. It was painful but survivable. Sarah's cattle were safe. The farm was saved. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd gotten away with something darker than destruction. That by letting the system take over, she'd escaped responsibility for her own desire for harm. Tom seemed to feel the same way. "It's not over," he said one night. "Watching the news report on the developer's ongoing legal battles with the contractor and Patricia and the county drainage board." "No," Sarah agreed, "but it's finished." She wasn't sure if she was right. The media had moved on by October. The drought had broken, rainfall was returning to normal levels, and the story of the farmer and the neighbor had been replaced by fresher, more exciting disasters. A politician's scandal, a celebrity's breakdown, a terrorist's cell disrupted. Sarah's criminal record faded from the news cycle like dust, but it didn't fade from her life. The felony conviction, even with the diversion program completion pending, meant Sarah couldn't get new agricultural loans or grants. Banks looked at her application and saw risk. The farm had been in her family for 3 generations. Now, nobody wanted to finance its future under her management. Tom had to take it on paper as the primary property owner, which caused other problems with the mortgage lenders and the second mortgage holder. It was a cascade of complications, each one a small humiliation, a reminder of how close they'd come to complete loss. The restitution payments came due at the beginning of each month. $1,200 every month for the next 7 years. It was money they didn't have easily. Some months, Sarah had to choose between paying the electric bill or the restitution. Tom started picking up extra consulting projects, working nights and weekends. Their marriage became a series of logistical arrangements separated by exhaustion. But the cattle were alive. The well was functioning. The farm still existed. Sarah tried to convince herself that was enough. It wasn't working. She was at the feed store in town one afternoon in early November when she ran into Patricia. For just a moment, Sarah didn't recognize her. The woman at the counter looked 10 years older than the Patricia Sarah remembered. Her clothes were expensive but didn't fit quite right, as if she'd lost weight rapidly. She was arguing with the feed store manager about a bill. "I paid this already," Patricia was saying, her voice tight and controlled. "I have a copy of the check in my car." "Ms. Whitmore, I have the check here." It bounced. "We need settlement before you can take any merchandise." Patricia's face went white, then red. Sarah watched this play out from the seed section where she'd been standing, pretending to read the backs of seed packets. It would be easy to leave, to slip out without being noticed. Instead, she found herself walking over. "Put it on my account," Sarah said to the manager. Both women turned to look at her. "I can pay for it," Patricia said quickly. "I know," Sarah said. "I'm offering anyway." There was a long moment where something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of exhausted recognition. "Why would you do that?" Patricia asked. Sarah didn't have a good answer. She found herself saying, "Because carrying around the need for vengeance is more expensive than kindness." It sounded like something from a greeting card. It tasted like a lie. But Patricia looked down at the items she'd been trying to purchase. Bulk feed, the cheap stuff, not the premium grain she'd probably bought before, and something cracked in her face. "I lost everything," Patricia said quietly. "I almost did too," Sarah replied. The manager was looking at them both with confusion. Sarah pulled out her card and told him to charge her for whatever Patricia's order was. Then she left before Patricia could thank her, or before Patricia could start crying, or before Sarah had to see any more evidence of how thoroughly life had consequences. That night, Tom asked how her day was. "I ran into Patricia Whitmore," Sarah said. Tom went very still. And I paid for her feed bill." "Jesus, Sarah." He set down his coffee. "Why?" "Because I wanted her to suffer, and then I got tired of wanting that," Sarah said. "Because holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." "That's not very original," Tom said gently. "No, it's not." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took Sarah's hand. His palm was warm, familiar. "Worn from work just like hers was. Are you okay?" he asked. Sarah wasn't sure how to answer that. She wasn't okay. She was likely never going to be okay again in the way she'd been okay before the drought. She had a felony record. She was a criminal in the eyes of the law. She'd destroyed someone else's property. And while the world had eventually sided with her narrative, that didn't change what she'd actually done. "I'm surviving," she said finally. "That's something." "Is it?" Tom didn't answer, which was honest of him. In November, the story resurfaced. A filmmaker had picked up the news reports and decided to make a short documentary about the drought and rural desperation and what happens when the legal system fails ordinary people. She interviewed Sarah, Tom, the sheriff's deputy, even Patricia. Patricia declined to be on camera, but agreed to be interviewed off the record. The film was called Dry, and it premiered at a small film festival in Denver. It won an award for short documentary. Suddenly, Sarah's story was being discussed again. But this time, in film circles, in discussions about environmental crisis and rural economics and the social contract. Sarah was called a hero in some circles, a cautionary tale in others, a symbol of the injustice of agricultural policy. She hated every second of it, being seen, being analyzed, being used as a symbol divorced from the actual consequences of her actions. It made the guilt worse, not better. Because if she was a hero, what did that make her criminal conviction? If she was a cautionary tale, who was she cautioning, and about what? The film brought unexpected attention to Patricia. 2 journalists tracked her down and discovered her story. A wealthy woman isolated by her own callousness, made poor by circumstances and the universe's cosmic sense of irony, now living in a modest apartment in the city and working as a consultant. One profile piece made her sympathetic, a woman brought low by hubris. Another painted her as a villain getting her due. Patricia gave one interview in which she said, "I made mistakes. So did she. The difference is, she had more to lose and she lost anyway. I just lost money." Sarah read that and felt something shift in her chest. It was dangerously close to understanding. Too close. In December, the first restitution check was due. Sarah sat down with the checkbook and wrote it out. $1,200, made payable to Patricia Whitmore. She stared at the name written in her careful script and felt the weight of that name, that person, that moment. She put the check in the mail without reading it again. 3 days later, it came back. Patricia had marked it refused in red marker and enclosed a note. "I can't accept this. You have your own life to rebuild. I have to rebuild mine on my own terms, or it's meaningless. Donate it to the agricultural extension, to emergency drought relief, to someone who needs it. Make it count." P.W. Sarah showed it to Tom. He read the note twice, then looked up at her. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Sarah didn't know. The law still required the payments, but Patricia was refusing them. The court could compel the payments to go into escrow, technically held in Patricia's name, but refusing the recipient meant the system got awkward and complicated. "I don't know," Sarah said. But she did know. She knew exactly what she was going to do. In January, Sarah established a scholarship fund through the County Agricultural Extension. the Millbrook Farm Emergency Agricultural Support Fund. She would donate the monthly restitution payments to it, money granted to farmers and ranchers facing agricultural emergencies. Drought relief, well failures, crop disasters. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was going to pay for her destruction by helping people exactly like she'd been. Patricia somehow found out and didn't object. She donated anonymously to the fund, a significant amount for the first year. No letter, no note. Just the donation appearing in the fund's accounting. Sarah never confirmed it was Patricia, but she knew. The farm survived. The cattle thrived. Tom and Sarah rebuilt what had fractured under the weight of crisis, though carefully, with the understanding that something broken and reglued is never quite the same. Sarah's felony was expunged at the end of the diversion program. She'd served her community service, teaching agricultural emergency preparedness at the county extension office, ironically, and had paid her restitution through the scholarship fund. The criminal record was sealed, but Sarah knew it would never actually go away. Digital records were forever. People's memories were forever. The farm became sustainable again. Sarah diversified her operations, added a dairy operation, started a farm-to-table produce operation with the pasture land that used to be just grazing. She became a voice in discussions about rural drought preparedness and agricultural emergency response. She was invited to speak at agricultural conferences. She was quoted in policy papers. She became, in some circles, an expert on what happens when systems fail ordinary people. She hated that too, but in a more productive way. She used the platform to advocate for better water rights law, for emergency relief funds, for protections for agricultural operations during environmental crisis. The scholarship fund she'd created grew. By year 3, it had given out over $200,000 in emergency aid to farmers and ranchers. She received letters from recipients, some thanking her, some never knowing that her restitution was funding their survival. One day in early spring of the 3rd year, Sarah got a letter from a law firm. Patricia had died, not suddenly. A cancer diagnosis caught late, treatment ongoing, and then finally the cancer winning. She'd spent her final months in a hospice facility upstate, and she'd made provisions in her will. She'd left money to the scholarship fund. A substantial amount, $50,000. Attached to the will was a letter addressed to Sarah personally. I don't know if you'll forgive me. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. But I've had a lot of time to think about that summer, about what I did, about what you did, about how two people can get so lost in pride and anger that they become worse versions of themselves. I think about the cattle sometimes. I think about how I could have shared a well and probably nobody would have even noticed. How the water I was protecting so fiercely would have made almost no difference to my life. But it would have made all the difference to yours. That's what I'm living with now. The understanding that cruelty is usually just a failure of imagination, not being able to imagine what it's like to be someone else. To have something at stake you can't bear to lose. I'm funding the scholarship because I want to be the kind of person who helps, finally. Because when I'm gone, I want there to be something good left behind in the world, something with my name on it. And I want it to be things like what happened that summer, but better, where someone survives because another person chose kindness instead of cruelty. I hope you got there first. I hope you're not still living in that summer. With respect and with remorse, Patricia Whitmore Sarah read the letter sitting at the kitchen table on an early spring morning. The sunlight came through the windows at a slant, catching dust motes. Tom was at work. The cattle were grazing in the north pasture, where the grass was just beginning to green up again. The letter made her cry, but not the way she expected to. It wasn't tears of forgiveness. It was tears of recognition. Patricia had been as lost as Sarah had been, trapped in the same cycle of harm and response and escalation, and perhaps that was the real lesson. Not that one of them had been right and one wrong, but that when systems fail, when people are desperate, when kindness seems like weakness, everyone loses. Sarah set the letter aside and looked out the window at her cattle, her land, her hard-won survival. She thought about the calf that had died in the heat. She thought about Patricia losing her home. She thought about the night she'd destroyed the well with a sledgehammer and the feeling of rage so pure it had tasted like metal. and she understood, finally, that this wasn't a story with a hero and a villain. It was just a story about two people and a drought and how the world breaks when nobody has enough. When Belle came up to the fence for her daily attention, Sarah went out and leaned against the old heifer's neck, breathing in the familiar smell of hay and sun-warmed hide. Belle had survived. Sarah had survived. The farm had survived. That would have to be enough. In the distance, where Whitmore Ranch used to be, the new owners had finally finished their renovations. The property was being sold again, to a commune, Sarah had heard through the grapevine. 30 people who wanted to live sustainably off the land together. The well was apparently going to be shared, a community resource. There was something almost poetic about it. Sarah stayed leaned against Belle as the sun moved across the sky. The cattle moving in the field, the world turning through another spring. She thought about cycles, water cycles, seasons, the wheel of fortune that turns everyone's luck eventually. She thought about what she'd learned, that desperation teaches you how capable you are of harm, that systems fail the people who need them most, that some debts are paid not in money or punishment, but in the quiet accumulation of better choices after you've made the worst ones. And she thought about Patricia, somewhere beyond the border of this world, maybe finally at peace with the person she'd failed to be. "We made it," she whispered to Belle, and meant it. The cattle grazed. The sun declined. The world continued, indifferent as always. But Sarah was here. The farm was here. The water flowed. That was the only ending that mattered.